Maybe sine?
What does the formula say? I'm just reading off the formula. I have to figure out what this cosine thing is, right here. So I look at my formula sheet. My unit circle, that is. Not my formula sheet, I guess. And I see that it's going to be 1 minus, and the cosine of 210 is negative root 3 over 2. Am I wrong on that, or? Oh, okay. And then that's all over 2. At this point, you get all but 1 point on the credit on the problem on your test. And all the rest of the points, of course, are for simplifying. So I'm going to start to simplify now. Plus or minus square root of 1 plus radical 3 over 2, all of that over 2, equals plus or minus radical 2 over 2 plus root 3 over 2, all over 2. Wait a minute, didn't we just do this one? Yes? Isn't this the same exact one we did? Like, numbers-wise?
Except for the...
Except for what?
Nothing.
Okay, so I know that my final answer, because I'm just going to jump to it right now because this is ridiculous, is going to be plus or minus 2 plus radical 3 all over 2. We've already done this problem once we get to the pink. Since this whole section is all about finding the correct formula, I look in number 6 at all of the formulas. And I'm looking for the one that says cosine of something times sine of something. So cosine times sine is this one right here, cosine sine. Notice how the u is the first angle, the v is the second angle. So when I write this down, converting it from a product, that means multiplication of two things, into a sum, which you see in the middle here, a minus sign, which is like adding the opposite, this is what I do. I have 1/2 bracket the sine, and then I add up the two angles. What are the two angles? 5x and 4x. Those are the two angles. They're right here. 5x, 4x. And then I have a minus sign. And then I have the sine. And this time I'm going to subtract the two angles. 5x minus 4x. Don't forget the bracket on the end. Of course, you have to simplify this. So the next step would be to write it in a simplified version, which I would write as 1/2 bracket sine of 9x minus the sine of x. If you wanted to, I would not take off or not going any farther. You could distribute the 1/2 to both things. So some people like to see their students multiply that 1/2 out. If you wanted to do that, you could. I would not take off points if you did not, because oftentimes factoring something out is considered simplified. So I would take either the red answer or the following. And you don't really need the parentheses for the x. You could have it there or not have it there. It's up to you. So red or gray is fine. Wow! A bunch more formulas that you get to use your formula sheet for. So these are called sum to product formulas, which means you start out with things being added, and then you go to things being multiplied. So in the first example, I'm looking for something that says cosine plus cosine. That means I'm looking for the formula right here, cosine plus cosine. In this case, I don't really know why, but they're using x and y as the two angles instead of u and v or a and b or whatever. Don't get tripped up by that. Following that formula, I'm going to go 2 times the cosine. There's going to be a parentheses. I'm going to add the two angles and divide by 2. So the first angle was 4x, and the second angle was 6x. And then next I'm going to write down the cosine again. from the formula. And this time I take the two angles and subtract them. So that's 4x minus 6x, and divide that by 2. Again, this is just using the formula that was highlighted. Take a look, see if you have any questions. Next step is to simplify the things that are inside of the parentheses. As I simplify them, I get 2 cosine of, in the first parentheses, 4x plus 6x is 10x, divided by 2, and I get 5x. Remember, this is representing an angle, like 5 times 10, which would be a 50-degree angle. And then I have the cosine. In the second parentheses, I have 4x minus 6x, which is negative 2x. Negative 2x divided by 2 is negative x. Now, what you may or may not know is cosine is an even function. So really, in the end, I need to write my answer the following way. 2 cosine 5x cosine x. Because the cosine of the opposite of x is the same as the cosine of x. And this is the most simplified version because cosine is an even function. If you don't remember what that means, you may go back and look at your notes that you've already taken with me on even and odd functions with sines and cosines. So in our last one, number 8, that we're going to do together in the notes, the big difference is that it's equal to 0, which means in the end, after you use the formula, you have to solve it and actually find the angle measurements. I look at what I see, and what I see are 2 sines being added. So I look up above, I look for the formula that shows 2 sines being added, and it says to do the following. 2 times the sine of, add up the 2 angles and divide by 2, so 5x plus 3x, chop that in half. And then there's times the cosine of, subtract the 2 angles and divide by 2, and that's all going to be equal to 0. So looking up above, here's where the sine plus sine formula was. And so that's the one I used. Now down below, I'm going to simplify these. As I simplify them, I'm going to have 2 times the sine, and 5x plus 3x is 8x. 8x divided by 2 is 4x. And then I have the cosine. 5x minus 3x is 2x, divided by 2 is just x. And that's all equal to 0. Oh, there's a 2 out in front. I can divide both sides by 2. So really what I have is the sine of 4x cosine of x equal to 0. In case you don't remember, this is the zero product property. This is saying that either the sine of 4x equals 0 or the cosine of x equals 0. I personally would prefer to work with the right-hand one first. So let's say I'm looking at the cosine of x being 0. Where does that occur?
Pi over 2. Pi over 2.
Excellent. Pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2. Those are the solutions for the right-hand part of this equation. On the left side of the equation, you notice that the sine is equal to, or we're taking the sine of 4x. Do you remember the blob stuff we talked about a couple days ago? How many solutions are there going to be?
8.
8.
Oh, wow.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, poo.
Yeah. Awesome. Super exciting. So let's try that.
Oh.
I have the sine of 4x equal to 0. And we talked about how this, if we ignored that 4x just for a second, and we said, hey, 4x, if that was just a blob, and we were talking about it, then that means I want to know where the sign is 0. Where's the sign 0?
Pi. 2
On 0 to 2 pi, not included.
0 to
0
to pi.
and pi. So the answers are that I would have this blob thing equal to 0 and pi. Now there's a problem. Normally my period is 2 pi. But now I'm going 4 times as fast, so I chop that into 4 pieces, and I find out that my period is pi over 2. That means I'm going to have 2 answers by the time I get to pi over 2. So as I solve this, what I know is that the blob, which was the green highlight, is not really blob. It's really 4x. So if I'm looking for x, I have to divide each of these things by 4.
Wow.
So if I divide each of these things by 4 to find out what x is, I find out that my x is going to be equal to 0 divided by 4, which is 0, and pi over 4. These are 2 answers. How many answers are there supposed to be? 8! 8. What's my period? Pi over 2. So in order to get to each consecutive answer, I'm going to add pi over 2. If I do that, here's what happens. I take 0 plus pi over 2 and I get pi over 2. I can add pi over 2 again and get pi. And I can add pi over 2 again and get 3 pi over 2. 0 plus pi over 2, pi over 2 plus pi over 2, pi plus pi over 2. I have now come up with 4 answers.
Wow.
The next ones are a little bit more challenging because I'm talking about a pi over 4 thing. So instead of using pi over 2, I'm going to use
3 pi.
2 pi over 4, which is the same as pi over 2. It's working with common denominators. So I'm going to do that each time. If I add 2 pi over 4 to 1 pi over 4, I get 3 pi over 4. If I do that again and I add 2 pi over 4 to 3 pi over 4, there's 5 pi over 4. And if you have any kind of sense of patterns whatsoever, you don't really even have to think about the last one. You know the last one's going to be 7 pi over 4. Because the top's just jumping by 2 each time. Congratulations, we're done.